I'm going to open our training methods and motivation data in SAS Studio here. So I'll double click on that data set, change our data set name to training methods, let's say, and import the data, take a look at it using our output data tab here. And what have we got? We have 12 observations, 6 with high motivation, 6 with low motivation. Within each of those motivation levels, 2 observations of each of the different training methods, self-study printed, classroom and computer-based, along with those completion times. Perhaps you already went ahead and found the group means for each of those using the summary statistics dialog. I'm going to jump straight ahead to the two-way analysis of variance, which we find within linear models, and not one-way analysis of variance now, but n-way analysis of variance, because we have more than one categorical variable, more than one factor. Okay, so double-clicked on n-way analysis of variance. I need to make sure that I select the right dataset, the work.trainingmethods dataset. Under dependent variable, I'm going to choose completion time, and for factors, I want to choose both motivation and training method. You could go ahead and click them one at a time if you wanted, but you could also do that a little bit faster by clicking that plus sign, selecting both of these, which you could do by holding down Shift and then clicking that down arrow, or alternatively clicking on one, then holding down Control, clicking on the other. Okay, so now we've got both of our factors in there. The next step that we need to do is one that we haven't seen before. In our model step, we need to tell SAS Studio how we want it to analyze this data. So we're going to choose Edit here, and that'll bring up those variables that we've selected. Again, we're going to want to highlight both of those, either by clicking on one, then holding down Control and clicking on the other, or holding down Shift once we've clicked on one just to highlight both of them. And now what we want is to add both of those terms in along with their cross product. Their cross product is the interaction term. And so we can do this a couple of different ways. We could add motivation, add training method, then select both of them and add the cross term. But that's a little bit slow, and it's going to be tedious if we've got multiple things that we're going to add in here. So what we can do instead is highlight both of them and then hit full factorial. That's going to add both the individual effects and their cross effect. Okay, so that's great, that's what we liked, that's what we want here. This is going to be our model then. We've got the effective motivation, we've got the effective training method, and we have the effect of the interaction between the two in order to test whether different levels of motivation will work better on different training methods. Options look fine. Let's hit run and have a look at our output. Okay, so taking a look at our output, we now need to run through our steps 1, 2, and 3. Let's check our data's been read in properly. 12 observations read and used, great. 2 levels of motivation, 3 levels of training method. Everything's looking good here. So now let's proceed through our steps. We'll do steps 1 and 2 in this video, and then we'll do step 3 in the subsequent video. So in step 1, we treat this as just a big one-way analysis of variance with 6 different levels, 6 different factors, where each of these combinations, high self-study, high classroom, high computer-based, low self-study, low classroom, low computer-based, are treated as completely separate groups. If we can't reject our null hypothesis in this step, then we have no evidence of significant differences among any of these 6 combinations, and so we should stop and say, hey look, it doesn't look like any of these things are affecting our dependent variable, completion time in this case. But that's not what we find. Here we find that we have significant evidence of some difference among those 6 groups. Our p-value for testing all 6 of those groups against one another is 0.0139. That's less than our 5% threshold. So we conclude that there is some significant difference across those 6 combinations. That's the end of step 1. Step 2, we now look at the interaction. And here's where things get a little bit out of order. That interaction is the last line on this table. Motivation times training method. As we move over here, we can look at its p-value, and this is a non-significant p-value. That p-value is bigger than 0.05, so that tells us that we are not going to reject the null hypothesis for interaction. Well, what was that? Well, the null hypothesis for interaction was that there was no interaction between motivation and training methods. Or put differently, the effect of motivation was the same across all of the training methods. Or, flip that around, the effect of training method is the same for all levels of motivation. We can't reject that null hypothesis, which is actually a good thing. It means there's no interaction and our life is a lot simpler. If we had rejected this null hypothesis, then we would have had to stop here and say, hey, look, there is some difference, but it's a complicated difference that we can't really, that we can't easily describe. We have to have a look at each of those 6 groups separately and describe any differences that we find. But we didn't find that, so we can move on to step 3 in the next video. Before we do that, though, we've got a couple of graphs here. These graphs show, actually just the one that's really important here. This graph is what we call an interaction plot. What it shows is a graphical look at the means for each of our groups. The red line here is for our computer-based results. The green line for self-study, the blue line for classroom. And so this should comport with what you saw looking at the data, that the classroom times were generally low, the self-study times were generally in the middle, the computer-based times were generally higher, and the times were generally higher for low motivation than high motivation. If we had interaction here, then we would have these lines not look consistent. This is a consistent set of lines where they're not crossing, they seem to have about the same slope. But when we have interaction, we'll see some wild things here. Maybe some of these lines crossing one another, or not having, or having very, very different slopes. But these lines looking pretty similar. We sometimes say parallel, even though these lines are obviously not formally parallel. When we see these lines that are pretty close to parallel, that's an indication that we don't have interaction between these factors.